suffering. And so I think part of Cesar's message, of course, would be also to call upon everyone to consider this, that the undocumented workers that are in our country are the ones that are not only feeding us, but taking care of our children, you know, doing our gardens and cleaning our buildings, preparing our food. And these are the same people that Cesar was working for, that he dedicated his life for.
We're going to go to a break, but I want to ask you to stay with us. Dolores Huerta, she is in Chicago, Illinois, one of the 9 states that celebrate today, March 31st, Cesar Chavez's birthday, as an official holiday. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back with her in a minute.
De marzo, jueves santo en la mañana, salió Cesar de Beleno, componiendo una campaña. Compañeros campesinos, esto va a ser un ejemplo, esta marcha la llevamos hasta mero Sacramento. Cuando llegamos a Fresno, toda la gente gritaba y que viva César Chávez y la gente que llevaba. Nos despedimos de Fresno, nos despedimos con fe.
Corrido de Cesar Chavez, Los Perros de Pueblo Norte, here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman, our guest Dolores Huerta in Chicago. I want to play a final clip of Cesar Chavez talking about the future of the farm worker struggle and the immigrant rights movement as he saw it in 1984.
We have looked into the future, and the future is ours. History and inevitability are on our side. The farm workers and their children and the Hispanics and their children are the future in California, and corporate growers are the past. Those politicians who ally themselves with the corporate growers and against farm workers and the Hispanics are in for a big surprise. They want to make their careers in politics. They want to hold power 20 and 30 years from now. But 20 and 30 years from now, in Modesto, in Salinas, in Fresno, in Bakersfield, in the Imperial Valley, and in many of the great cities of California, those communities will be dominated by farm workers and not by growers, by the children and grandchildren of farm workers and not by the children and grandchildren of growers. Like the other immigrant groups, the day will come when we win the economic and political rewards which are in keeping with our numbers in society. The day will come when the politicians will do the right thing for our people out of political necessity and not out of charity or idealism. That day may not come this year. That day may not come during this decade, but it will come someday. And when that day comes, we shall see the fulfillment of that passage from the book of Matthew in the New Testament. The last shall be first, and the first shall be last. And on that day, our nation shall fulfill its creed, and that fulfillment shall enrich us all.
That was Cesar Chavez. Dolores Huerta, Chavez's view on immigration, the issue of illegal immigrants being used by the growers to take the jobs of migrant workers.
Well, it wasn't so much the issue of them taking the jobs of migrant workers. In fact, the United Farm Workers was always the largest organization of undocumented. And when we started the union, Cesar and I actually legalized hundreds and hundreds of immigrants, because when the first bus settle program ended back in 1963, then we actually legalized over 500,000 of the ex-braceros without any legislation. It just started to happen. And then, of course, in 1986, I actually worked in Washington for 4 months to get the amnesty bill, and we had 1,400,000 undocumented farm workers then that became legalized, and now, of course, it's time for another legalization. So it was always trying to get justice. The one issue that we always had with the farm workers union and building the union was to keep out strike breakers, and sometimes people would confuse this with saying that you're against undocumented. We have never been against undocumented. We've actually been in the forefront of legalization for people who were undocumented, and continue to be so to this day. The farm workers union has offices where they actually help people become legalized, and they also have offices in Washington, D.C. that are working continuously to try to get legalization for the farm workers and for other workers for that matter.
Dolores Huerta, there is a state holiday, 9 states, including the one you're in Illinois, honoring Cesar Chavez today, his birthday. Is there an effort to make it a federal holiday?
Yes, actually there is a national effort right now that is going on, in Joe Baca, who is the head of the Latino caucus, and the Congress has actually introduced a bill to make Cesar's Day a national holiday. And actually there's another bill that you might be interested in that's by Congresswoman Hilda Solis to make all of the places where Cesar lived and worked to make them historical sites. But that is currently being blocked by the Republicans in the Senate right now, but we have hopes that that will be able to pass. And I think Cesar's statement was very prophetic, and what he mentioned about the role of the Latinos. We've seen that the Latinos have been extremely effective in this last election in terms of supporting Senator Clinton, and they have actually made a really big mark because of their voting. And in California, they actually voted 30 times more than the other populations. So I would say that I never thought of Cesar as a prophet, but obviously with this last statement that he did show that. The other thing I want to mention is this, is that in some of Cesar's greatest moments, like during his fast, he did 3 fasts, the first one for nonviolence, the second one for people to get the political courage that they needed to fight for themselves, and the third one was against pesticides, and that was the fast that he did for 36 days in Delano to bring attention to the economic poisons that are being put on our food. The point I wanted to make, Amy, was that sometimes his voice was louder when he didn't say anything, because during all of those 3 fasts, Cesar never was able to speak. When Senator Kennedy came to Delano to break that first fast, he didn't speak at all, but yet his voice was so loud, and that was kind of like that silent voice of justice, and it still is, of course, we can hear the ramifications of his voice on this day, March the 31st, where so many states and so many places are having events, parades, marches, luncheons, breakfasts, whatever, masses honoring Cesar Chavez. That voice of justice of his is very loud, and it still is resounding throughout our country today.
Dolores Huerta, I want to thank you very much for being with us, joining us in the studio in Chicago, Illinois, co-founder of the United Farm Workers with her longtime comrade Cesar Chavez. Today, he would have been 81. His birthday celebrated as an official holiday in 9 states. We'll see if it will be celebrated by the entire country if the federal effort to succeed in making his birthday a federal holiday succeeds. Thank you. As we turn now to our last segment, U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson will unveil his blueprint today for the biggest overhaul of financial regulation since the Great Depression. As the dollar continues to sink and the credit crisis continues to grow, Paulson's expected to outline the Bush administration's plan for Washington's role in the market. But some analysts suggest the proposal will have little to do with the real scope of the current crisis. In an article in the Chicago Tribune, Italian economist, journalist, author Loretta Napoleoni argues recent events on Wall Street indicate a much larger upheaval and could, quote, signal the end of the roaring 90s, nearly 2 decades of easy money, cheap credit, and soaring global debt. It's an argument Napoleoni develops in her latest book called Rogue Economics, Capitalism's New Reality. We're joined right now by Loretta Napoleoni just before she heads back to London. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
What do you mean by rogue economics?
Well, rogue economics is a sort of umbrella under which we find the criminal economy, the illegal economy, but also those gray areas where there is not a proper regulation, where there is not legislation for the economy. Now, these gray areas in this particular crisis have been created by globalization. Now, this happens generally when there are great transformations. We've seen it during the Industrial Revolution, but we also have seen it during during the crisis of 1929. The economy suddenly started moving faster than politics, and politics can't manage to keep pace with it, so can't manage to regulate the economy. So the current crisis is the product of the 1990s, of the easy money, cheap credit of the 1990s.
You begin your book with a very provocative idea of democracy and slavery coinciding in many different countries at many different times.
Yes, that's one of the phenomena of rogue economics. So I found a correlation between the spreading of democracy after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the rise in slavery. Now, as countries, former communist countries, became so-called democratic, people started to be enslaved by their own countrymen.